What we've just seen is an incredibly distressing account of how this migrant crisis in Europe is going so badly wrong. You've seen both ends of this, the European side and the Nigerian side. Why are things still so terrible?
I think there are two reasons that go to the heart of this crisis. First of all, in northeast Nigeria, you have continued rule by Boko Haram of an area covering about 2 million people. You've got continued conflict. You've got an enormous amount of suffering. The trauma of the people who are coming out from under Boko Haram rule is huge. But you've also got people being propelled into refugee status and then making the trek north. Now, what you've shown is people trafficked or smuggled, and that remains a route to hope. At the European end, you've got continued confusion about whether or not cases are properly processed, about what's going on in Libya and how that is run, and also this terrible moral confusion about whether or not rescuing people from the sea is going to be some kind of quote-unquote magnet for them. And it seems to me that Europe needs not just to improve the efficiency of its work, which is a major priority. There are still 40,000 Syrians stuck in Greece waiting for their cases to be processed from 2 years ago. But there's also got to be the moral clarity that says we're not going to allow people to drown in the seas off Europe.
But isn't it effectively Europe's policy at the moment to let people drown, to put them off from coming?
No, what they'd say is that Europe's policy is to support one of the three Libyan governments and make sure that they have the resources to interdict the smugglers before they set off. Remember, we're coming from a situation where deliberately smugglers were not putting sufficient gas in the boats to get all the way to Lampedusa or to Italy. So the European approach, they would say, would be one, to make sure that the Coast Guard works properly, two, to go upstream further into Africa to make sure that you're addressing the conditions on the ground. That's not happening properly yet, because the partnerships that Europe has said it wants to develop for humanitarian aid in countries like Niger or in Cameroon that are receiving, in this case, Nigerian refugees, is not working properly. And thirdly, the tackling of the smuggling rings that are bringing people through North Africa has not worked with anything like the degree of clarity or determination as has happened in Turkey.
A lot of people in Europe are saying, why should Europe take in Nigerian refugees? There are places in Nigeria they can go to.
Well, there are, although because of where the conflict is, they're actually being forced into Cameroon or into Niger. They can't get into the other parts of Nigeria. But I think it's very, very important to say that refugees have hard-won rights in international law that protects them because it's not safe for them to go home. And the reason that Europe has to make a choice is that either it lives by its ideals or it abandons them. And the choice for Europe is actually, is it going to have unplanned, unregulated, illegal, disorganized and deadly migration, or is it actually going to have an organized legal route to hope for those who need it, while also recognizing that immigration policy is separate from refugee policy and needs to be handled effectively as well?
This is basically the theme of your book, isn't it? That Europe is at risk of betraying its moral commitment to refugees.
Yeah, well, yes, the theme of my book is that the fatalism about the refugee crisis is not well-founded, that there are policy solutions out there. But secondly, we have to rescue our very own identity, because it's only after the Second World War that refugees were ever counted. It's only after the Second World War that they had any rights at all, first of all in Europe and then more broadly. And now we face this extraordinary situation where the countries that invented refugee rights in North America, in Europe, are in the process of abandoning them at a time when they're needed more than ever, because there are record numbers of refugees around the world.
This is very personal for you, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, I'm not a refugee myself, but my parents were both
we've got some images that you used, I think, in one of your talks of your dad. This is personal for you, isn't it? Because you've been looking at your own family history, and we've got some images, I think, of your parents as refugees.
Yes, I used this in a TED Talk. The guy on the right is not actually a handsome version of me. The guy on the right is my dad, and the guy on the left is my grandfather. That's a picture taken in London in 1940. They were both Belgian refugees who came to the UK when the Nazis invaded Belgium. And I mean, literally, I wouldn't be here if Britain had not taken my dad in 1940 and my mum, also a refugee.
We've got a picture of your mum as well as a girl. What's her story?
So that is part of a larger picture of a group of Polish schoolchildren arriving in the UK in 1946. She survived the war thanks to being sheltered by some very brave Poles. And then she was sent here as a Jewish child refugee in 1946. So you're right that global politics is different. The religion of most of the refugees who are being helped around the world today is different from my family, but there is this personal connection. And I think it's very, very striking, at least to me, that the countries that should have done the most to invent the idea that refugees need status and special status are now abandoning that. And I think it's very important to take on that sense, either that charity needs to end at home, not just begin at home, or that this refugee crisis is so big that solutions can't be found. Because for moral reasons, but also for strategic reasons, if this continues to burn, it's going to wash up on our shores in one way or another.
Well, if you've come up with some solutions, what are they?
I think that there's a couple of things that are absolutely key. The traditional image of a refugee is someone who's out of their country for a short period of time, lives in a refugee camp, and then goes back home. Yet the truth is today, less than 1% of the refugees in the world go home, and 60% of them are in urban areas. So what that says to me is, first, employment becomes absolutely key. The adult refugees need to get into work. The countries that are hosting them, countries like Lebanon or Jordan, countries like Kenya or Uganda, need support to help those refugees into work. Second, half of all refugees are kids. Yet less than 2% of the global humanitarian budget goes on education. That is both a scandal and an extreme stupidity. Because when refugee displacement is 10, 20 years, it makes no sense at all to leave an uneducated population there waiting for the next bounce or the next round of radicalization. And the third thing that I think is important is that we need to make refugees part of the market economy. Rather than tents or food, they need cash, actually. Not necessarily cash in literally cash, but mobile money to help them participate in the market economy. They're in urban areas. They need to bring something to the local community. And we've found that for every $100 that you give to a refugee, there's $214 of economic activity in a local community. So there's a benefit for those who are hosting them if you change the refugee system.
So you're talking about changing the whole way aid agencies work?
I think
no
so.
longer big food convoys into refugee camps, but plastic cards.
Certainly that should be the future. There's, at the moment, 84 million people are fed by the World Food Programme around the world, and many of them need it. In fact, all of them need it, but many of them might not be able to have cash as an alternative because they're not living in an area where there is a market economy. But for those that do, we think we can massively ramp up the use of cash as an empowering device for those who are in especially in the urban environments, but actually also in some camp environments. This aid system has to be modernized because this point about the duration of displacement changes the whole equation, both for hosting countries and for the refugees themselves.
Is this a clever way, though, of keeping Muslims out of Europe?
No, I think...
keeping them near their homelands?
No, because I think that you'll see that the book argues very strongly that both for moral reasons and for geostrategic reasons, it's incredibly stupid to crack down and stop Muslim refugees finding a second chance in life. In the United States, where we run refugee resettlement agencies in 26 US cities, the fact that President Trump has slashed the number of refugees from the average of 90,000, he's set a limit of 45,000. We've projected this week that only 15,000 refugees are going to be resettled in the US this year. In the process, he's fulfilling precisely the fear of the former head of the CIA, Mike Hayden, who said, look, if you send the message to Muslim communities that we don't respect you and we don't honor your religion, that is precisely feeding the clash of civilizations that is so dangerous.
You've gone from politics into this world of aid agencies. Do you feel that there is a vacuum of leadership now in the world on this issue?
Well, there's not just a vacuum of leadership on the humanitarian issue. What's driving up the numbers of refugees, remember there are record numbers of refugees and displaced people, what's driving up the numbers is the crisis of diplomacy. And I now live and work in New York. The United Nations General Assembly came to New York in September. There was no sense of urgency around the crisis in Yemen, around the crisis in South Sudan, around the ongoing 30-year crises in Afghanistan or Congo. And that crisis of diplomacy speaks to the very heart of the claim that's being made by the US administration, that America first means the withdrawal from the world. And frankly, it also speaks to the consequences of the Brexit crisis here, because there's no question that Britain has been a big player in peacemaking and peace building around the world, and it's far harder to do that in splendid isolation.
How is Britain viewed now from where you sit internationally?
I think Britain is viewed with a great shake of the head because we are seen as the ultimate pragmatists. We're seen as people who are cautious, not hot-headed. Yet we seem to have taken the most grievous risk with our own future. We've bought a future without knowing what it means. And there is sadness, real sadness, among those who want to make the global order more secure, more stable, more equal, that the British voice is being withdrawn, and it's real.
But the Brexiteers would say Britain's voice isn't being withdrawn, it's being amplified, because we'll be our own sovereign state. We will stand as ourselves rather than just as part of Europe.
Well, of course, we do stand up as ourselves as a member of the Security Council of the United Nations, but we are 5, 10 times stronger for being a member of the European Union. And we're 5 or 10 times stronger, not just because of the power of 28 as opposed to the power of just one. We're also 5 to 10 times stronger because how we're seen in Moscow, in Washington, in Delhi, in Beijing. And it really is, I never like to be in the US when I'm forced to say that Britain is driving off a cliff, but that is the political reality that faces any foreign policy analyst today, that Britain is driving itself away from engagement in global affairs at a time when it's needed more than ever.
As a former foreign secretary, are you embarrassed of the current one?
The current government, or
the current foreign secretary?
I mean, I think it's more serious than saying whether or not I'm embarrassed about a personality. What I would say is that you need to have a foreign secretary leading a government that is able to project clear and substantive policy in international affairs. And that is not being done. And in a way, it's more serious than a personality issue. It's that the whole of British politics has been taken over by this Brexit issue. It's crowding out everything else. Now,
the opportunity cost is huge then, isn't it?
Well, there is
what is being lost here?
There's a massive opportunity cost. And Parliament seems to be in the process of finding its voice on Brexit, because we cannot be in a situation where democracy dies on the 23rd of June 2016. But globally, we need a British presence more than ever, but not in splendid isolation. The danger is that far from having the loud voice that you describe, we are like a cork bobbing in the sea. I think it's very striking. If you listen to President Macron today, some of his critique of the European Union, that it's too slow, that it is not decisive enough, could come from the mouth of a Brexiteer. But the conclusion he makes is precisely the opposite. To regain sovereignty, European nations need to bind together more closely. And I think that's a very powerful message, both in domestic policy on energy or on climate, but also on global policy and foreign affairs.
Do you think Brexit is stoppable?
Yes, it obviously is stoppable. It's both.
I mean, the man who wrote Article 50 says it is.
Well, I was the Foreign Secretary when we put through Article 50. And there are two things that I remember very, very clearly about it. One is that no one in their right mind believed that any country would trigger Article 50, give away its last card in the negotiating process before it knew how it wanted to exit. Yet that's what we did in March 2017. But secondly, it was very clear that the letter to the the President of the European Council that is mandated in the Lisbon Treaty is, of course, reversible, because you don't know what would happen in a country in the space of the 2 years. The question is whether politically there is the will to look at this again. And my point is that the deal that is going to become clear, I think that the only form of Brexit is a hard Brexit. That deal needs to be scrutinised in Parliament, and it also, in my view, needs to be put to the British people, because for the first time they would be comparing what does a European future mean and what does an isolated future mean.
Does that have to mean another referendum, or could it be a general election?
Well, I think it's very hard to overturn the result of a referendum without the engagement of the people. And we've just had a general election, so I don't think that a general election is coming to the rescue of this issue. What needs to come to the rescue is, first of all, the kind of parliamentary scrutiny that's right. I mean, it's incredible to most people who are looking around the world that there should even be a debate about whether or not Parliament should have a say. Of course it should have a say, because you can't, in the end, put a stop to a democratic process. We're meant to be a representative parliamentary democracy.
If you put together all of that with what's going on with Trump, is the truth that all these international crises, such as Yemen, are just going to carry on and get worse?
Well,
there is no hope, is there, for things like that?
Well, I think people underestimate the impact of what America first means, because the tragedy is that it's increasingly going to mean America alone. And that's going to create vacuum. In places like the Far East, it will create a vacuum that is filled by China. But in places like the Middle East, it will be filled by a range of actors, including very, very dangerous actors like ISIS/Daesh, the recrudescence of which we have to have very firmly on our agenda, even though Raqqa has been freed from their tyrannical rule. And America can't act alone internationally. It needs to be part of the web of international engagement. But I think we're in an unprecedented position where America becomes what I would call a revisionist power in the global system. Instead of defending the global system, instead of being the anchor of the global system, it's actually pulling the bricks away from it.
To bring you back to the question of refugees specifically, I mean, let's talk first about your trip to Nigeria and its relevance in what we've just seen in the last few days with these tragedies, with these drownings. I mean, what did you learn there about what refugees really need?
Well, there's a food crisis, there's a water crisis, there is an education crisis. Never mind the extraordinary scenes that you've seen there of these massive encampments that have been set up. There's also a military crisis because there remains significant Boko Haram danger and significant Boko Haram rule in parts of northeast Nigeria. And so that Nigerian experience speaks directly to the kind of diplomatic stroke political effort we've talked about and to the renewed humanitarian effort, because even that Nigerian effort is only 50% funded. And in a world where we're not even meeting the most basic needs, which water and food definitely count as, we're actually taking a huge risk with our own future.
On a personal level, you've also had some sort of resolution, haven't you, with your own refugee story, with your mother's refugee story. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary because the great untold story in our family was about what happened to my grandfather, also named David. I was named after him. We knew that he died in the war, in the Second World War. My mother never saw him after she was 5 years old. And 6 months ago, I got an email out of the blue from the organizer of a German local historical society near Stuttgart who wanted to confirm whether or not I was the grandson of David Kozak, because he and his fellow volunteers had ascertained that David Kozak was documented to have been shipped from Auschwitz to this other concentration camp near Stuttgart in November 1944 and had died and been buried in a mass grave on January the 19th, 1945. And so just 6 or 8 weeks ago, the remains of our family, my brother, myself, my aunt and my mother went to Stuttgart to see the site of this, what's now a burial, an appropriate grave, and also to reflect with the local German population about their drive to come to terms with the truth. And they run an organization called Gegen Vergessen für Demokratie, against forgetting for democracy. And so there was this extraordinary personal element to the journey, but also this bigger truth-telling story about coming to terms with history in order to be liberated from it.
How did that motivate you now in terms of what you're doing, in terms of what refugees require from politicians?
Well, it sounds like a cliche, but obviously you cannot but go to the site of a concentration camp and repeat that phrase never again. Inevitably, whether or not you have a personal connection to it, the sheer daily terror and daily sadism, frankly, that went on there is the greatest driver of any fuel of humanity that one has. And I took enormous inspiration, not just from the story of my own family, but also from the way in which these successive generations of Germans had determined that they would not be a community that turned their back on the rest of humanity.
Are you coming back? Here?
I'm very committed to what I'm doing. When you say, are you coming back? I'm like, I am here. Well,
the question people ask
I'm here in person. I took a big decision, or we took as a family a big decision to go to the US 4 years ago. I feel very privileged to have been able to do what I've been doing for the last 4 years. I feel I'm making more difference doing my current job than I could doing anything else. And as long as that's the case, then it's right that I commit myself to this. We're now a $750 million NGO with 27,000 staff, and we're driving towards a different kind of humanitarian system. And that gives me a sense of drive and motivation and fulfillment. And I think it's important that I see that through.
David Miliband, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.